Hello viewers, welcome to my YouTube channel. Get ready for heart-touching stories. Don't forget to subscribe and let's begin.
The day I came home from Afghanistan, it rained. I remember thinking that was appropriate somehow, the sky weeping in a way I no longer could. I had been gone for 14 months. 14 months of sand and heat and the kind of silence that follows an explosion, that thick, ringing nothingness that settles over everything before the screaming starts. I had left as Marcus Elroy Calloway, 24 years old, strong enough to carry a 100-pound pack across 12 miles of broken terrain without complaining. I came back as something else entirely, a man with a reconstructed left knee, a shattered right shoulder held together by titanium screws, and a nervous system so frayed at the edges that the sound of a car backfiring could send me flat on the ground with my hands over my head. But I was alive. That was what I kept telling myself on the transport home, on the connecting flight, in the back of the cab that smelled like pine air freshener and old coffee. I was alive and I was going home and everything was going to be okay. I should have known better. My mother opened the door before I even reached the porch steps. She looked at me the way you look at something broken beyond repair, not with cruelty exactly, but with a kind of helpless resignation, like a mechanic studying a car that isn't worth fixing. Marcus, she said, just my name, nothing else. My father appeared behind her. He shook my hand. Firm grip, quick release, the handshake he reserved for strangers and distant cousins. My younger brother Devin leaned against the doorframe with his arms crossed, and I could see in the set of his jaw that whatever had existed between us before I left had quietly died while I was away. They fed me dinner that first night. My mother made pot roast, my childhood favorite, and for a moment I thought maybe I had imagined the coldness at the door. We sat around the table and I tried to tell them about the physical therapy, about the progress the doctors said I was making, about the job training program the VA had connected me with. Nobody asked questions. Devin scrolled through his phone. My father talked about the truck he was thinking about buying. My mother got up twice to refill the bread basket that nobody was eating from. I was in that house for 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, I learned that my family had constructed a life in my absence that had no room for who I had become. They wanted the old Marcus back, the easy, laughing, uncomplicated young man who had kissed his mother's cheek and jogged out to the recruiter's office like he was heading to a pickup basketball game. They did not know what to do with the man who woke at 3 in the morning drenched in sweat, who flinched at loud noises, who sometimes sat at the kitchen table staring at nothing for 20 minutes at a stretch. They didn't say it cruelly. They said it in the language of sighs and averted eyes in conversations that stopped when I walked into a room. Devin said it most directly one evening when my mother was at church and my father was watching television. Different, he said. He was not being unkind. He was simply stating a fact, the way you note that the weather has changed. You came back different and it's hard on everyone. I nodded. I understood. Understanding didn't stop it from feeling like a door slamming shut. 6 weeks after I came home, my mother sat me down and suggested very gently, very carefully, that it might be better for everyone if I found my own place. She had printed out a list of VA housing assistance programs. She slid it across the table with a cup of coffee like it was a peace offering. Maybe it was. I took the paper. I drank the coffee. I left 3 days later. I had nowhere to go except one place. Grandpa Elroy, my father's father, the man I was named for, lived 40 minutes outside of town on 11 acres of land that had been in the Calloway family for 3 generations. He was 71 years old, built like a man who had spent every one of those years doing physical work, with hands like leather and a white beard he trimmed every Sunday after church. He had called me twice while I was deployed, always on Sundays, always brief. He didn't ask about the fighting. He told me about his garden, about the weather, about a fox that had been getting into his chicken coop. Normal things, steady things. When I called him from a gas station parking lot with $40 in my wallet and a duffel bag in the back of a borrowed car, he picked up on the second ring. I was wondering when you'd call, he said. I don't have anywhere to go, Grandpa. You do now, he said. Come on. He met me at the end of his gravel driveway. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late October, and the oak trees on either side of the drive had gone gold and copper, their leaves falling in slow spirals in the still air. He looked older than I remembered, but solid, rooted like one of those trees, the kind that bends in a storm but doesn't break. He didn't shake my hand. He hugged me long and hard, the way men of his generation rarely do, and I felt something crack open in my chest that I hadn't known was sealed shut. Come eat, he said. Then sleep, everything else can wait. House was exactly as I remembered it, the same quilts, the same cast iron skillet hanging by the stove, the same smell of wood smoke and something herbal I could never identify. He had set up the back bedroom for me. There were two thick blankets on the bed and blackout curtains on the windows. He had thought about what I might need before I even arrived. I slept for 14 hours. The bees came into the story 3 days later. I had been sitting on the back porch in the cold morning air, wrapped in a flannel jacket, staring at the field behind the house when Grandpa came out carrying 2 tin mugs of coffee. He handed me one and sat down in the old wooden rocker beside me without a word. We sat like that for a long time, watching the frost on the grass catch the early light. You want something to do? He finally asked. I said I didn't even have to think about it. Doing nothing was the enemy. Stillness gave the bad thoughts room to move. Come with me then. He led me past the garden, past the woodpile, to the far edge of the property where the land sloped gently toward a line of cedar trees. And there, in a clearing that caught the southern sun from mid-morning to late afternoon, stood 8 white wooden boxes arranged in 2 neat rows, the hives. I had known about them in the abstract, he had mentioned his bees on those Sunday phone calls, but standing in front of them was something different. Even in late October there was still activity, a low deliberate hum coming from inside the boxes, a few bees moving in and out of the small notched openings at the base of each hive. Getting ready for winter, Grandpa said, clustering up inside. They won't need much from us now until spring, but there's still work. There's always work. He handed me a veil. That first morning he just talked. He showed me how to approach a hive without sudden movements, how to read the sound the colony made, the difference between a calm hum and an agitated buzz, the pitch that meant they were content and the pitch that meant something was wrong. He talked about the winter prep work, checking the hive bodies for structural damage, making sure the entrances were reduced to keep out mice, laying on the upper entrances to allow moisture to escape. I didn't do much that day. Mostly I watched and listened. But something happened to me standing there in that cold field with the hum of those hives moving up through the soles of my boots. Something in my nervous system that had been coiled tight since Kandahar, since the day the IED took out the vehicle ahead of ours and I ran toward the smoke instead of away from it, began very slightly, very tentatively to loosen. The bees did not care about my injury. They did not care that I flinched at sudden sounds or that sometimes I lost minutes at a stretch to memories I couldn't control. They responded only to stillness and steadiness. The calmer I was, the calmer they were. It was the most honest transaction I had encountered in years. I came back the next day, and the next. By December I could inspect a hive frame on my own, lifting it carefully, holding it at an angle to catch the light, reading the comb for signs of disease or stress. Grandpa stood nearby and coached me but let me work. He had a gift for teaching that involved very little talking. He would watch, and when something needed correcting he would simply do the correct thing himself, silently so I could see it. My shoulder ached in the cold. Some days I could barely lift the hive tool. On those days Grandpa found other work, mending equipment, repainting hive bodies, rendering wax from the summer's harvest in a pot on the kitchen stove. There was always something that needed doing, and he always framed it as something he needed help with. Though I came to understand that he had been managing this land alone just fine before I arrived, he was giving me purpose. He knew without ever saying so that purpose was the thing I needed most. We talked sometimes in the evenings after dinner, seated at opposite ends of the kitchen table with our coffee going cold between us. He told me about his own hard years, a failed business in his 40s, a brief period when he and my grandmother had almost divorced, the death of his youngest son, my father's brother, in a construction accident when that uncle was only 32. He didn't tell these stories for sympathy. He told them the way you hand someone a map when they're lost. Look, the story said, here is the terrain, here are the places where the path almost disappeared, here is how I found it again. I told him things I had told no one. About the morning I'd heard screaming from a building and gone in alone against orders and found 3 children alive in a collapsed room. About the guilt I carried for the ones I hadn't been fast enough to reach. About the way my family's eyes had slid away from mine at the dinner table as though whatever was happening inside me was too uncomfortable to witness. He listened. He didn't fix anything. He didn't offer solutions or silver linings. He just received what I said and held it without judgment. And that I was learning was rarer and more valuable than almost anything else one person could offer another. Spring came slowly, then all at once. In March the red maples bloomed and the bees began flying in earnest, returning to the hives trailing orange and yellow pollen like tiny cargo ships. Grandpa and I started full inspections, going through every frame looking for the queen, assessing the brood pattern, checking for mites. The colonies had overwintered well. 7 of the 8 hives were strong. By April I could do an inspection start to finish without guidance. I could spot a queen among 50,000 bees, recognize healthy brood from diseased, know from the sound and smell of a hive whether something was wrong before I even lifted the cover. Grandpa watched me work one afternoon, and when I finished and pulled off my veil he nodded once, slow and deliberate. Got good hands, he said. The bees trust you. Coming from him in that moment, it was the finest compliment I had ever received. My knee had improved through the winter. I'd been doing the exercises the physical therapist had assigned, walking the property every morning, gradually increasing the distance. The shoulder still gave me trouble, but I had learned to work around it, to adjust. The nightmares had not disappeared, but they had become less frequent, and when I woke from one now I was able to ground myself faster. In the smell of the wood smoke, the distant sound of the hives, the solid presence of this old house that had stood through 3 generations of difficulty and was still standing. In May, something unexpected happened. A woman named Ruth, who ran a small farm stand about 4 miles down the road, stopped by to ask Grandpa if she could buy a few jars of his honey for the stand. She had heard about it from someone in town. They stood in the driveway talking, and Grandpa called me over and introduced me as his grandson who was running the operation with him. I shook Ruth's hand. We talked about the harvest, about the spring bloom, about what varietals the bees were working. She looked at me the way people rarely had since I'd come home, with simple, uncomplicated interest, the way you look at someone who knows something worth knowing. Before she left she mentioned that she'd had 2 hives die over the winter and didn't know why. Would I be willing to come look? I went the following Saturday. The problem turned out to be varroa mites combined with inadequate ventilation. I walked her through what I was seeing, what had likely happened, what to do differently next season. She took notes on a small pad of paper, nodding seriously. On the drive home I realized my hands had not shaken once. That summer we expanded. 2 new hives, a second bee yard on the eastern edge of the property to work the clover field. Grandpa taught me to extract honey, the uncapping knife warm in my hand, the frame spinning in the extractor, the raw honey flowing amber and thick into the settling tank. We bottled 300 jars. Ruth took 60 for the stand. We sold the rest through word of mouth. It wasn't a fortune, it wasn't meant to be. But it was something I had made with my own hands, out of knowledge I had earned through patience and attention and a willingness to be still. There was a transaction in it that I understood. You give the bees good conditions, careful stewardship, genuine attention. They give you honey and something harder to name, a sense of participation in something ancient and ongoing. Something that does not stop for wars or wounds or families that don't know how to look you in the eye. My mother called in August. She wanted to know how I was doing. The call was awkward for the first 5 minutes and then something shifted and she talked for a long time about how she hadn't known what to do, how watching me struggle had frightened her in ways she couldn't explain, how she was sorry. I told her I was okay. I told her I meant it. Devin came out to the farm in September. He didn't call ahead, just showed up one Saturday morning with a six-pack and a look on his face that said he'd been working up to this for a while. We sat on the back porch and drank beer in the afternoon light, and I took him out to the hives as the sun was going low. I suited him up, walked him through the approach, let him hold a frame. He was terrified and then fascinated and then for a moment completely still in a way I recognized, the way you get when something pulls you fully into the present and everything else falls quiet. This is something, he said softly, watching the bees move across the comb. Yeah, I said, it is. I am still here on this land with these bees. 2 years now since I arrived at the end of that gravel driveway with $40 and a duffel bag. Grandpa Ellery moves a little slower than he did when I came, lets me carry more of the weight, which I understand is the point. I am not the man who left for Afghanistan. I am not the man who came back, either, that hollowed, flinching stranger who frightened his own family with the dimensions of what he carried. I am something else now, something that was built slowly out of cold mornings and patient work, and the particular grace of 11 acres and 8 hives and one old man who knew that the best thing he could offer was not comfort or advice, but simply presence and something useful to do. The bees taught me that recovery is not a single moment. It is not a switch that flips or a door that opens all at once. It is 10,000 small acts of returning to the hive, returning to the work, returning to the present moment again and again until the present moment begins to feel like somewhere you can live. My family cast me aside when I returned home wounded, but the bees and the man who kept them gave me back everything I had lost. And then, quietly, patiently, they gave me things I had never had before.